Welcome to The Free Will Show, a podcast that provides a beginner-friendly introduction to free will while also exploring cutting-edge developments on the topic. I'm Taylor Sear.
And I'm Matt Flummer. In this episode, we talk with Scott Davison about petitionary prayer. We begin by talking about what petitionary prayer is, and then we talk with Scott about some challenges to petitionary prayer from divine free will.
Thanks for listening. I'm happy to introduce Scott Davison, professor of philosophy at Morehead State University. Scott has written on several topics that regular listeners of this podcast will be interested in, including moral luck, Molinism, and much more. He's the author of several books, including two on today's topic, which is petitionary prayer. One of those books is called Petitionary Prayer, A Philosophical Investigation, and that was published by Oxford University Press in 2017. And the more recent one is part of the Cambridge Elements series, and it's called God and Prayer, and it was published by Cambridge in 2022. Some chapters of the first of those two books explore how divine freedom may generate a challenge for petitionary prayer, and so we've asked Scott to talk with us about those parts of his work today. Well, welcome to the show, Scott. Can you start by telling us a bit about yourself, your work, and how you came to be interested in working on issues related to free will?
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. It's a real honor to have my work showcased, and I appreciate what you're doing here on the podcast and how you've been at it for a long time. I think it's a real service to the community, so thank you for both of those things.
You're welcome. Thanks.
My dissertation, my doctoral dissertation, was about free will and moral responsibility, and at that time I was really interested in what makes human beings distinctive, and I thought maybe the answer had to do something with libertarian free will and a strong degree of moral responsibility. So I tried to defend that picture in my dissertation and to develop an account of degrees of moral responsibility. That's what I was trying to do. Now, over the years, after teaching and writing about free will, my views have changed a little bit, and I've lost some of my libertarian conviction. So now I think that something like Manuel Vargas's revisionist account of compatibilism is maybe more plausible, but I'm not sure. And I think that's okay too. Not to know what the answer is, not to have a lot of confidence because it's such a complicated question. I do think that science has really progressed a lot on this front since I wrote my dissertation in terms of understanding how the brain makes decisions and how different parts are needed for the stages of a decision to work together. We discover some things by studying brain injuries and diseases. And now it looks like, although we don't completely understand what the brain is doing, there seems to be less room left for the kind of looseness that a libertarian picture requires. And also, I think when we study the stages of making a decision, it's not clear where we would want there to be indeterminism. I think here Daniel Dennett might have been right way back in 1983 when he said, we want our decisions to be determined by our best information, except in toss-up cases, and those are not really interesting. So anyway, I said, we don't have to be confident about everything. I'm officially kind of agnostic about free will now.
Interesting.
Yeah, cool.
These days, you asked about me. I was going to finish that answer. I mostly work on issues in the philosophy of religion and value theory. And you mentioned my books on prayer. My first book was called On the Intrinsic Value of Everything. And I argued in that book that everything that exists has some degree of intrinsic value. And that was a really fun project. And I still work in that area recently, defending the idea that we can think of worship as a kind of limit case of our appreciation of the intrinsic value we see in ordinary things. And then you mentioned my first book on prayer. That was kind of designed to explain the whole debate about petitionary prayer in gory detail. So talk about all the challenges, all the defenses, all the philosophical questions, kind of chart the whole map of that debate. And then the later piece, the Cambridge Elements, is just a short follow-up, which explains how the debate has changed in new and really interesting ways, I think, since the earlier piece. Until recently, I was the associate editor for the journal Faith and Philosophy, which is one of the journals in philosophy of religion. And then I also run a rabbit refuge in my backyard where I take on pet rabbits who need a new house. So I have all these right now I have 11 rabbits of different colors and shapes and sizes running around. And then in my spare time, I renovate and repair houses. So that's what I do.
Oh, wow. Very busy. Yeah. Well, as Taylor mentioned, and you've mentioned your books, our topic that we wanted to ask you about today was petitionary prayer. Before we talk about the philosophical issues of the topic and how it relates to free will, could you say a little bit about what petitionary prayer is?
Yeah, I think that's important. There are lots of different kinds of prayer in all the different religions of the world. And it's important to remember this because people sometimes assume that prayers always take this petitionary form, but they don't. Some prayers are designed simply to basically pay the deity a compliment. Those are like prayers of praise. Others are designed to apologize for something we've done. Those are prayers of confession or repentance. One of the most common forms of prayer, though, involves requesting that the deity bring about something in the world or do something. And those are the petitionary ones because they involve petitioning the deity to do something, a request. So that's what a petitionary prayer is.
All right. And in your book, which we've already talked about, you defend a contrastive reasons account of answered petitionary prayer. Since that account's going to be relevant for our discussion of petitionary prayer and divine free will, could you describe that account for us?
Yeah, sure. I'm going to back up just a little bit to try to explain first what that account is supposed to do, what problem it's supposed to address.
Mm-hmm.
So it might seem like a simple thing, and I think for a long time people assumed that it was a simple thing to say what it means to say that God answered a prayer. And you can see running through the early years of this debate that there's a certain answer that's assumed, but it's obviously not right. So this is not the same question as whether God has actually answered any prayers. That's a different question if there is a God, whether God has in fact answered prayers. It's really a question about what it would mean for God in principle for something to count as an answer to prayer. And so in the book, I'm assuming that God is an agent who has beliefs and desires and acts for reasons. So questions about divine freedom come up. If we don't think that God is an agent in that sense, then I don't think you would have questions about freedom. And I think your discussion of answered prayer would be quite different. But that's sort of a basic assumption that I start with. And most traditional theists, I think, are going to be in that camp, although not all of them. So let me give you a couple of examples here to try to illustrate the problem about what it means to say God answered a prayer. And in general, the question is, what does it mean to do something in response to a request? So that's what I'm trying to get at. So just suppose, and this not exactly this happened to me, but I did spend some time teaching in China for a semester and visited there many times. Suppose you're in an airport in China, and suppose you don't speak any Chinese. I actually do speak some Chinese, but suppose you are there and you don't speak any, and a soldier comes up to you and shouts, "Wei Xian Paxia," and you don't know what that means. But you're very frightened because the soldier has just shouted at you, and so you hide behind a chair. Now, it just so happens that what you have done is what the soldier told you to do, namely take cover. But it's not because of what the soldier said. You didn't understand what the soldier said. You're just alarmed by the fact that a soldier shouted at you, naturally so, you hid behind a chair. So in order to count as a response to a request, this is not a response to a request. You did what the soldier requested, but it's not because of what the soldier requested because you didn't know. So the content of the request has to play some role in explaining your behavior. You have to know what's requested of you. So here's a different example, a little closer to home. Suppose my neighbor has a tree that hangs over into my yard, which in fact he does, and it needs to be trimmed. And in fact, it does. He'll never hear this. Imagine that I ask him to trim the tree, and he does trim the tree. But suppose that he had planned to trim the tree anyway on that very day because he wanted to use the limbs for holiday decorations, not because I asked him to do it at all. He would have done exactly the same thing, even if I didn't ask for it. And in fact, he almost didn't trim the tree because he would have preferred to make me angry, but that reason was not strong enough, and so he went ahead with his original plan. In this case, I think it's a mistake to say that my neighbor's trimming of the tree was a response to my request, because he had his own reasons They were sufficient by themselves. My request played no role in explaining why he trimmed the tree.
Mm-hmm.
Now, my other neighbor on the other side, who will also never hear this, asked me to change something about the fence that I'm building between us. Now, I didn't have a reason to do this before he asked me to, but I am going to do it because he asked me to. In this case, I think it's clear my action in changing the fence is going to be a response to his request because my desire to do what he asked me to do plays the right role in explaining my behavior. So the challenge in general is to say what counts as answering a request. And that's what this contrastive reasons account was designed to do. So let me turn to that. It's an account of what it would be for God to answer a prayer, but in general, it is supposed to be really an account of what it means to do something in response to a request. Okay?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
All right. So it's clear that a simple correlation account is not going to work. So it can't be the case, for instance, that if I pray for rain and it rains, then that's enough to say that my prayer was answered, because it could just be a coincidence. Maybe there's a correlation. Every time I pray for rain, it rains. That doesn't mean it's not sufficient to say that my prayer was answered, because it could just be luck, right? And there's some funny examples here. We could also think about what's assumed in the old literature on this question, a kind of simple counterfactual dependence account. By counterfactual dependence, I mean something like this. The thing would not have happened if I had not prayed for it. That's not enough on the one hand, because the offering of the prayer, the petitionary prayer, might cause the thing that's requested to happen, even if God is not involved. There's a case of this in the literature. A philosopher named Lawrence Mazik, he describes praying for hurricane victims somewhere across the other side of the world. And when you pray for those victims, it makes you worry about them. And the worry causes you to donate, and your friend sees you donate, and then your friend's friend sees you donate, and then a bunch of people donate, and it ends up helping those people. But God is not involved in that chain. So it's true that the prayer, if you hadn't offered the prayer, they wouldn't have been helped. But that's not enough to say that God answered the prayer. So it's also not necessary. And here we get into a case that's sort of like a Frankfurt case, which we'll talk about later. Suppose that I ask God to do something, and God does it because I asked. And so we want to say God answered my prayer. But if I hadn't asked for that thing, let's suppose you would have asked instead. And then God would have answered your prayer. So the same thing would have happened. It wasn't necessary that I ask. But intuitively, it still seems to count as a case of answered prayer. So counterfactual dependence is not necessary or sufficient. And then in the book, I consider a couple of other more sophisticated ways to try to answer that question. Accounts by Tom Flint and Alex Pruss. And then I finally get to the thing I want to defend, which is what I call the contrastive reasons account. So let me explain what that is and how it helps, or how I think it's supposed to help. And then we can talk about how it leads to questions about divine freedom. Okay?
Sounds good. Yeah.
Okay, so the contrastive reasons account says that a petitionary prayer is answered by God if and only if God's desire to bring about the thing requested in the prayer, just because it was requested, plays an essential role in a true contrastive explanation of God's activity, bringing about that thing rather than not bringing about that thing. When I say that God's desire to do the thing requested plays an essential role in this explanation, I mean that if we took God's desire out of the explanation, it would no longer work. It would no longer explain what happened. Now, I don't say that God's desire to bring about the thing just because it was requested is God's only reason for bringing about that thing. God might have other reasons too. I assume God would have other reasons too, because it would be a good thing, presumably, in some respect, for a good thing to happen in the world, that everything's connected to everything else. There's a great paper by Saul Smolanski about about prayers for bad things, which is really fun, which I recommend for your listeners to read. Prayers for bad things, kind of funny stories in there. But anyway, like praying for your neighbor's destruction. Anyway, so God might have other reasons too, but God's responding to the request has to be one of the elements that explains why God does what God does. Otherwise, the prayer doesn't play, the offering of the prayer doesn't play the right role. And you can see that in terms of the examples we just discussed. So there must be some connection there. And the tricky part is to explain what the connection is. So this was my attempt. A contrastive explanation simply explains why one thing happens instead of something else. So the idea basically is there must be a successful explanation of why God brought about this thing that was requested in the prayer rather than not doing so. And that explanation has to include, as an essential element, the fact that it was requested and God wants to do that thing because it was requested. So that was my stab. And there's a lot more detail here, and I consider a bunch of cases and explain why they either count or don't count as answered prayers according to this account. So there's a lot to the defense that I won't try to summarize here, but so that was what I was after. And I should note in passing that since that publication of that book in 2017, some people have really sort of turned up the magnification and questioned this. And I want to mention one response briefly from Dan Johnson, who notes that whether we count explanations as being successful depends in general on our interests across the board, explanations in general. And he suggests if we just want to be on God's team, so to speak, we might not care if our prayers actually make a difference in the way that's required by the contrastive reasons approach. We might not care if our request plays that central a role. And I agree with him about this, actually, and I discuss his work in the Cambridge Elements volume. But I do think most people have in mind something like making a difference when they imagine God answering a prayer. And that's what they typically hope to accomplish. They want something to change. And they pray in the petitionary way when they're powerless to do anything else. Like something really matters and they want it to change, but they can't do anything. Like I say in the book, we don't ask God to pass the salt because that's something we can do by ourselves. But I do think Johnson makes a really interesting point there, and it's worth noting.
Yeah, cool. So you distinguish between two different views on divine freedom, and in the book you discuss challenges to petitionary prayer based on each type of view. So before we get to the challenges, could you introduce these two views on God's free will?
Yeah, sure. I think if your listeners are tracking this, roughly they are the leeway and the sourcehood libertarian pictures. But let me explain to you the way I go through them in the book a little bit and how they're different. Before we turn to the question, the dilemma that I generated in that chapter. So the first view is something in the book I call it the strong libertarian view. So it's a libertarian view, and I'm sure your listeners will know that this means that there are different ways to say this, but roughly free action can't be determined by the sum total of what's happened before, plus whatever laws of nature hold, or whatever binds the future to the past. They probably also know the famous argument, developed by Harry Frankfurt, according to which somebody might freely perform an action even though the outcome was inevitable in some sense, because someone else would have intervened to ensure that specific outcome had the person not chosen on their own to do what they did. So a strong libertarian, as I use the phrase here, requires that in order to perform a free action, you have to be able to do otherwise. So they resist Frankfurt's conclusion. They don't think that could be a free action if you can't do otherwise. And in the literature, sometimes following Kevin Timpey and others, they might call this leeway picture, because there has to be leeway. And then, some people believe that at least with respect to some things, God has strong libertarian freedom in the sense that God could do otherwise. And a classic example of this from the Abrahamic faith traditions involves God's decision to create the physical universe. So most traditional theists historically have held very explicitly that God didn't have to do that, and things would have been fine if God had remained alone. But God freely chose to create instead, and they are resisting the rival view of Plotinus and the other Neoplatonists who thought that the physical universe had to emanate eventually from the one by necessity. They're also resisting Aristotle's idea that the physical universe has always existed and, in some sense, doesn't depend on God as an efficient cause. So, historically, there are clear cases, and I think for Roman Catholics, it's sort of official that God has strong libertarian freedom with respect to creation. Now, the other sense in which God might be said to be free doesn't require that God be able to do otherwise. And so I would think of this more as a sourced view, and you see this in C.S. Lewis and Tim O'Connor and other people. Now, you couldn't imagine, I don't think you can see a case like a Frankfurt case for God, because there couldn't be somebody that could intervene and compel God to do something.
Yeah.
That's not going to work. But you still might say that God doesn't have to be able to do otherwise in order to act freely. There's conceptual space there. So,
Right.
so it's kind of like what you would say if you were to be persuaded by Frankfurt about a human choice that that they, and you could have somebody who has libertarian freedom in a Frankfurt kind of situation. So, suppose what they do is not determined by the sum total of the past plus the laws of nature at that moment. Now, it's a live question what they could have done differently. Maybe there's a flicker of freedom, as Martin Fisher has criticized all the flicker of freedom approaches to Frankfurt. But maybe it's hard to say exactly what they could have done differently. I've written about this myself, but suppose they, in the Frankfurt cases, the intervener does nothing, right? It's just a potential intervention. It's not that the outcome is overdetermined. Overdetermination implies two complete causal chains, terminating in the same effect. One of these causal chains remains merely potential in the Frankfurt case. So a person could choose, as in a libertarian sourcehood, conditions are all satisfied. A person's not determined. They do what they want to do. It's just that if they had at all been inclined to do something else, the intervention would have prevented them from doing otherwise. So you could still satisfy the conditions on libertarian freedom, at least those negative ones, in the sense that your action is not determined and not be able to do otherwise. And this is the sourcehood picture, so not the leeway view. So God's freedom could be like that. And so it could be, for instance, that the sum total of God's reasons points in only one direction. And since God is essentially rational, there's really only one option. But we want to say that God is free. Because there's nothing compelling God outside of God to do what it is that God does. So those are the two views.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, in the summary of each of these two views would be they both share the incompatibilism or lack of determination, but one requires alternative possibilities and the other one doesn't.
Exactly right. Yes, the strong picture is the one that requires alternative possibilities, and the other view doesn't.
Good. Well, suppose we take the view that does require alternative possibilities, the strong libertarian picture for divine free will. What challenge or challenges might that pose to petitionary prayer?
Yeah, so here, I'm turning up the magnification a little bit, so we're getting into some of the more technical detail. And the argument that I offer in the book here is pretty dense, and so I'm going to try to summarize that without going too deeply into the weeds, as we say.
Sure.
Although, of course, the weeds are, we love the weeds. The weeds are great.
Underrated.
In the weeds. But so I'm going to take an example from Alison Thornton, who has just written a great paper on petitionary prayer that was published in Faith and Philosophy in the last year. And I think she makes a really interesting argument here that helps me to explain what I was reaching for in my chapter here. So in her example, she imagines, suppose that I break my arm and I pray for God to heal my arm. And suppose my arm is healed. Now let's call that the actual sequence of things, to borrow terminology from John Martin Fisher when he's talking about the Frankfurt cases. Now, if this is going to be an answer to my prayer when my arm is healed, according to what I defended in the contrastive reasons account, then God's desire to heal me because I asked for it must play a certain role in explaining God's healing activity, right? It must be an essential part of the explanation of God's choice. But if God is free in the strong libertarian sense, then God could have chosen instead not to heal me in the very same circumstances, given the very same reasons. Um, let's call that the alternative sequence, following Fisher's terminology again. It's popular for philosophers to say, to express this in terms of possible worlds. If God could have chosen otherwise, that means there is a possible world that has exactly the same history as ours, the actual world, leading up to that moment, except that God decides in that other world not to heal my arm. And then things go differently from then on, right? And God decides which world is actual when God chooses what to do. Here I'm talking as if God is deciding in time what to do. And of course, that's a controversy in the philosophy of religion, but that's just a convenient way of speaking that you don't have to express it that way. So, so in the alternative sequence, God doesn't heal me. If God had chosen not to heal me in that alternative sequence, in that other possible world, then there would have been some reason for that, because God is essentially rational. So it's not like God can suspend rationality. Whatever that reason was in the alternative sequence, it would have played the role in that alternative sequence that the sum total of God's reasons for healing me played in the actual sequence. But that just violates what it means for there to be a contrastive explanation of God's decision to heal me in the actual sequence. To have a contrastive explanation which explains why one thing happened rather than not, it just means that there's something that plays the role in the actual sequence where it happens, where nothing plays that same role in the alternative sequence where it doesn't. So we don't have a contrastive explanation of why God healed me at all. And then the contrastive reasons account says, well, then it doesn't count as answered prayer after all, because things could have gone either way. And so we don't know why God did what God did. It looks like a toss-up. If God could choose whether or not to heal me, the sum total of God's reasons can't be decisive. But if it's a toss-up, if God heals me, then the desire to heal me because I asked for it doesn't play a strong enough role for us to say that God answered my prayer. That's basically the problem. Things could have gone either way. If God healed me, there must be some other explanation why. And my prayer doesn't make the right kind of difference. So that's the problem for the strong libertarian picture.
I wonder if you're thinking about it the same way. It kind of reminds me of the way that people talk about the problem of luck for libertarians, where it seems like, things could have gone either way. So you didn't ensure, or, it wasn't really up to you which way things went. But sort of, I don't know, an application of that puzzle to God in the situation of responding to prayer.
Yes, I think that's a very helpful observation. So if this is the way it works, then it's kind of a mystery why it went one way rather than another. And so it does feel like a matter of luck. And that's not the picture that we get when people think about the point of offering petitionary prayers. They don't imagine rolling the dice. They think, it's, that they imagine they're appealing to the reasons that God would share to want the same thing to happen. So they're trying to kind of draw God's attention. They want to make a difference in that sense. They don't expect that it's a matter of a toss-up.
Right.
Yeah. You also consider a challenge for petitionary prayer if we give up the strong libertarian view of divine free will. Could you describe the challenge that's based on this view?
Yeah, sure. This is a little bit easier to explain. So if God's freedom doesn't require that God be able to do otherwise, then, God's decision to heal my broken arm can be free, even though God can't do otherwise in those very same circumstances, given everything that's coming, before that moment, along with my prayer, the sum total of God's reasons, if God heals my arm, it must favor that. And then the contrastive reasons account applies very straightforwardly. There is an explanation why my request can play a role in the right sort of, an essential role in explaining why God does heal my arm. No problem there. But then it seems, and this is the rub, I think, is then it seems like if God doesn't have an alternative in that situation, if I offer the prayer in the right circumstances, God has to answer it, which is weird.
Yeah.
It
Yeah.
feels like God doesn't have a choice. And that also is
Mhm.
a tension with our ordinary picture, because we imagine an agent, approaching an agent, making a request, and the agent decides yes or no. If God is essentially rational and the reasons line up in the way they do, and God's freedom doesn't require alternative possibilities, it looks like, God has no choice. And that's a puzzle. Uh, and I don't think there's a question here whether God can choose the values of the weights of the reasons that God is presented with. I
Mhm.
think there are problems with that picture. I don't think it doesn't make sense to me to have God be able to choose what the values of those weights are. But maybe that's one way to think about this, and to escape the problem. But, typically we think if we're offering prayers, we're trying to influence God's action. But if the reasons don't line up in the right way, it just would be impossible for God to answer.
Mhm.
And if our prayers somehow tip the scales, it must be because they add some additional good thing that occurs just because we ask. And philosophers have created some really ingenious theories about what this could be. How in the Cambridge book, I call it the added value question. Like, what is it that offering a prayer, how does that change the situation? What does that add, that gives God sort of an additional incentive to grant the request? Because God may have lots of reasons for granting it independently of the question whether there are any prayers.
Mhm.
Because things are good in themselves, things are good connected to other things, and so on. But as Allison points out, if I'm deciding whether to pray for something, I might wonder whether I should want to change God's reasons in the first place. For my broken arm. Imagine my broken arm. She says, if it's best that my arm be healed, I should want that. If it's best that my arm not be healed, I should want that instead. Either
Right.
way, it
Yeah.
seems, she says, I should just ask God to do the best thing and not try to influence what the best thing is, and not ask for anything particular. And then what's the point of petitionary prayer? What's the point of asking God to do the best thing, especially if God's already essentially rational and benevolent and omnipotent? And I think that's a serious practical concern, and it's highlighted by this second view of freedom, where God doesn't have alternative possibilities. So I think Allison does a really good job of explaining that, and I think it illustrates the problem. So if God doesn't have strong freedom in that strong sense, there's no problem from the contrastive reasons side of things. It's just that
Right.
it threatens to seem to make a petitionary prayer kind of pointless. Like, my prayers might happen to line up with what is best, and then God has no choice. But if they don't, then God can't make an exception, so to speak.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, we've talked about some challenges, kind of regardless of which of these two views of divine free will that we go with. Do you think these challenges are a decisive problem for theists who defend petitionary prayer, who practice it?
No, I don't think they're decisive. I think they maybe warrant further consideration, and I really appreciate the opportunity to talk about them here with you
Mhm.
today, and explore them in further detail. And I think there are other people working on these questions who, smarter than I am, who are going to shed some light on them someday and help us to understand how to think about them. I just think they highlight some puzzling aspects of the picture, and that was kind of the point. Um, you can
Yeah.
resist the contrastive reasons account in the first place, like I explained. You can go the Dan Johnson route. Um, you can
Hmm.
also go down the path that I mentioned, where philosophers explain how just the offering of the prayer by itself changes the situation and what's at stake, and so changes God's reasons. Although that doesn't answer all the puzzles. I think the
Sure.
challenge about the strong libertarianism, when it's coupled with the contrastive reasons account, is a really good, weird puzzle. I was really happy with that one in some sense. Not
Yeah.
because I'm, happy to raise problems, but because I just thought putting those things together, they fell into place in a way that generated a good puzzle. So I'd like to see more struggling over that one. And I continue to struggle with it. But I don't think they're decisive. No, I think they're every philosophical argument is reversible and resistible. It's just that it draws attention to the things we care about and causes us to think about how to preserve those things without saying other things we don't want to say. And I guess that's kind of what the challenge for philosophy in general is. So,
Yeah.
Hopefully these questions will spur other people on to work on these issues and help us to think about them more clearly. But as I said about free will at the beginning, it's okay not to know how everything works and what the right account is, and puzzles are okay even if they're unresolved. I'm still puzzled by some of Zeno's paradoxes. I think some of them still work. So I'm not convinced by that explanation. So that's okay too. We have a kind of, I don't want to say a kind of fetish around confidence. Like all by itself, confidence is a virtue, and I think in philosophy, maybe especially, confidence might be a sign of something else. And so I think it's okay not to be absolutely confident. It's okay to have doubts and concerns and not to tie up all the answers and have them all be consistent with each other. So, that's okay too.
Yeah. Maybe a lack of intellectual humility.
Yeah, I didn't want to say that, but I think there's something to that. Yeah, there's a reason why these problems are philosophical, that they've endured, they've resisted solution, and lots of smart people have thought about them. And so, yeah, I hesitate to say that I've solved anything.
I like that picture of how philosophy can work. I think I share a similar kind of approach. So that's a good word. Yeah. Well, thanks so much again, Scott, for joining us. Where can listeners go to follow your work?
I guess you could just Google around if you want to see what things I've published. I do have a website, but it just lists those things really. If you want to read something I've written or you want to talk to me about something, just reach out to me by email. I'm happy to field inquiries that way. I do lecture here and there sometimes, but I don't really have a breaking news channel that you can follow related to activities. I'm more sneaky that way. So. Yeah. Thanks so much for having me. I really appreciate this opportunity to talk about these things, and really encourage your listeners to think through them and do what they can to try to understand these questions.
Yeah, you're welcome. Thanks again. The topic of our next episode will be God, Purpose, and Reality, and our guests will be John Bishop and Ken Perzik.